My name is Eleanor Vance, and the woman my son married said something behind my back that cracked my heart in two. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It happened on a Tuesday. Not a stormy night or a dramatic showdown, just a regular Tuesday. The kind with leftover coffee in the pot and laundry half dried in the machine. I had come over to David and Kira's house to drop off a casserole, an old habit that made me feel useful. I'd knocked, but no one answered. The front door was slightly ajar, and I figured they were in the backyard. I stepped inside quietly and set the dish down on the kitchen counter. And then I heard it. Kira's voice, calm, steady, casual, drifting in from the den. I think a lot of David's depression comes from how he was raised. He didn't really learn how to express things. He never felt safe enough to. There was a pause. A woman's voice on the phone murmured something I couldn't make out. Kira continued. It's not abuse or anything. It's just emotional absence. You know his mom, Eleanor, she's always been polite, kind, but distant. Everything was always neat and fine. But David never got to fall apart. My hands went cold. I stepped back from the kitchen island, steadying myself on the back of a chair. I didn't mean to listen. I didn't want to listen. But her words clung to the air like smoke, sharp and impossible to ignore. He internalizes everything she went on. He's terrified of disappointing people, but he never really learned how to let anyone see him. It's like he was raised in a house where emotions had to be checked at the door. I stood frozen, caught between the instinct to walk away and the unbearable curiosity that held me rooted to the floor. I know she means well, Kira said, but in some ways, I think she broke him without even realizing it. That line, it echoed. She broke him. Me. I slipped out of the house silently, unnoticed, the casserole forgotten on the counter. All the way home, I couldn't breathe. Kira hadn't said it with venom. That was the worst part. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She wasn't ranting or accusing. She was calm, thoughtful, even compassionate. And that's what made it hurt more. She believed it. She believed I had done something to my son that was irreversible. That I had, through kindness and silence and structure, created a man who couldn't open his own heart. And I couldn't ignore the truth behind her words, not entirely. I raised David alone after his father passed. I was 37, working full-time as a therapist, managing grief and responsibility with clenched hands. I gave him structure. I gave him safety. I gave him everything I had. But maybe I didn't give him me. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed trying to remember the last time David had told me something real. Not surface-level updates, not casual jokes. Something raw, something painful. I couldn't. He used to talk to me all the time before Kira, before adulthood swallowed him whole. He used to sit on the kitchen counter, legs swinging, telling me about school and his worries and his dreams. But somewhere along the way, the words stopped coming. And I had told myself it was normal, that boys grow up. That distance is part of motherhood. But what if it wasn't just growing up? What if it was something I built into him? The next day, I called David. I didn't mention what I'd overheard. I couldn't. Not yet. I just asked how he was. I'm okay, he said. That was always his answer. I'm okay. I tried to listen for something beneath it. Something cracking. Kira said, you've been feeling low lately. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said eventually. But I'm managing what I wanted to ask. I wanted to push, but I didn't. Instead, I said, you know I'm here, right? For anything. Another pause. I know, Mom. But it didn't sound like he believed it. That night, I stood in the hallway staring at a photo of us David at 5 years old, missing front teeth, clutching a stuffed dinosaur, me, kneeling beside him, smiling like I had all the answers. But I hadn't. I had survived. That was what I'd done. I survived grief and single parenthood and long nights of worry by becoming the kind of mother who held everything in place, who kept things tidy, predictable. I thought I was protecting him. But what if in doing so, I taught him that emotions were something to hide? What if my strength had been his burden? I sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight. I wanted to hate Kira for what she said, but I didn't. Because deep down, I think she was right. And now I had to face something far harder than blame. I had to face the truth. The next time I saw David, it was in my own living room. He came by to fix a loose hinge on the corner kitchen cabinet, something I could have lived with for weeks, maybe months. But I'd mentioned it offhandedly in a text, and he'd replied with a simple, "I'll stop by tomorrow." No emoji, no warmth, just obligation dressed as kindness. When he walked in, his body moved through the house like it was unfamiliar, like each room carried a weight he didn't want to hold. He greeted me with that polite half-smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes anymore. It was like looking at a memory of him wearing the same face but blurred around the edges. As he crouched near the cabinet tools spread out like a small battlefield on the floor, I stood nearby watching him. For the first time in a long while, I didn't speak. I just studied him, the slope of his shoulders, the tired curve of his spine, the stiffness in his jaw. "How are you really doing, David?" I asked. My voice soft, unsure. He didn't look at me, just kept fiddling with the screwdriver. "Fine, Mom. Just busy." But his voice didn't have edges. No frustration, no dismissiveness. It was flat, like someone reading a grocery list. That scared me more than if he'd yelled. I sat down at the table and folded my hands in my lap. My heart pounded even though the house was quiet and nothing about this scene was new, except everything was. I overheard Kira the other day. I said the word surprising, even myself. His hand paused for just a moment, then resumed its motion with a slow, deliberate turn of the screw. "She said something about me," I continued, my throat tightening. "About how I raised you." He didn't respond. The screwdriver clicked once more against the metal, then he closed the cabinet door with a soft thunk. Finally, he stood up and turned to face me. "I figured you might have heard," he said quietly. Not defensive, not angry, just resigned. "She said I made you—" "Closed off," I whispered. "That I wasn't emotionally there for you." He didn't flinch. He didn't rush to disagree. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, not contempt, not distance. It was something older, something heavy, sadness. I braced myself. Was she right? He sat down across from me, hands folded on the table mirroring mine, like a courtroom, like a reckoning. "I don't think you were trying to do harm," he began slowly. "You were always composed, controlled, strong. But there wasn't room for anything messy in our house. Not grief, not confusion, not even disappointment. Everything always had to be fine." I didn't breathe. He kept going. "You were never unkind, never cold, but it felt like emotions had to be folded up neatly and put away. If I was upset, you gave me advice. If I was scared, you gave me logic. If I was sad, you handed me a plate of food and said, 'This will pass.'" He smiled faintly, not fondly, but with fatigue. "I learned to perform being okay, because I didn't think you could handle me if I wasn't." I looked down at the table. My hands were trembling. All my life, I had tried to be the stable one, the mother who never let anything fall apart. When his father died, I told myself I couldn't break naught in front of him. He needed structure, safety, predictability. I turned grief into routine. I folded pain into politeness. I thought I was protecting him, but I had taught him to protect me instead. I didn't want to make mistakes, I said. My voice cracked on the word mistakes. I know. I didn't know how to sit in pain with you. I was afraid if I let you see mine, you'd carry it too. He nodded slowly. That's what I do. Carry things. And never put them down. I reached across the table not to touch his hand, but just to close the distance between us. You're not broken, David, I said. You never were. He met my gaze. Maybe not. But I've been lonely, Mom, even when I was with you. Especially then. That shattered me. He wasn't blaming me. He wasn't angry. He was just finally telling the truth. And I, the woman who made a career out of helping other families communicate, hadn't seen the silence in my own. After he left, I sat in the quiet, the same chair, the same room, but it all felt different. Like the air itself was heavier. I thought about all the times I gave him a gentle pat instead of a hug. The times I asked, "Are you okay?" but didn't wait for the full answer. The Sunday calls that grew shorter. The letters from college I never got. I remembered thinking no news is good news, but maybe silence was its own kind of wound. Later that night, I pulled down the photo album from the top shelf. There he was, 5 years old, missing teeth, clutching that ridiculous green dinosaur. Me beside him, smiling. But now I looked closer. I saw the way his little hands were clenched, the tension in his shoulders. Had it always been there? Had I always missed it? I pressed the photo to my chest. He wasn't lost. He hadn't vanished. But I had to earn back something I didn't know I'd lost. Not his love. His trust. The trust that I could handle his feelings, even the ones that scared me. Even the ones that started with "you hurt me." And I would. Because if I couldn't go back and change what I'd done, then I would show up for everything that came next. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Not in the way that lets your body rest or your mind soften. I lay there flat on my back, watching the ceiling shift in soft shadows from the orange glow of the street lamp outside. The house creaked faintly, like it was remembering too. My heart didn't race. That would have been easier. Instead, it sat in my chest like a quiet weight, not heavy enough to crush, just firm enough to keep me from drifting. The things David had said earlier kept replaying. Not in words, but in his eyes. In the way his hands curled together on the table. In how he didn't interrupt, didn't fight, didn't even look surprised when I asked if I'd hurt him. It was as though he'd been waiting for me to finally ask. A memory surfaced around 2 a.m., sharp and clear, like a shard of glass. David, maybe 11 years old, standing in the hallway with his blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His small voice barely more than a whisper. I had a bad dream. I had lifted my head groggy and half-conscious and told him, "You're safe, sweetheart. Go back to bed. It'll pass." I didn't get up. I didn't open the covers and say, "Come lie beside me." I didn't ask what the dream was about. I didn't wrap him in my arms. And he had turned obedient, silent, and walked back down the hall with only his own shadow for company. At the time, I thought I was teaching him independence. That's what I told myself. Raising a boy to be strong, resilient, self-soothing. But now I saw it differently. What I saw now was a child reaching for comfort and being told gently to go manage his fear alone. And that image, that soft-footed retreat down the hallway, haunted me until morning. By dawn, I found myself at the kitchen table, a blank notebook open before me. I hadn't written in it in years, not since my therapy days. It was leather-bound, the edges worn, a relic from a time when I had all the clinical language in the world and none for myself. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I picked up the pen and started writing. Not letters, not a plan, just memories. Moments I missed him. Moments I corrected instead of connected. Moments I dismissed something small, thinking it would vanish, not fester. I listed them as they came. like unwelcome visitors finally knocking on the front door. Some were obvious. Others were like pebbles in my shoe that I'd walked with so long I'd forgotten the pain. I wrote until my hand cramped, and the ink on the page began to blur from the tears I hadn't realized were falling. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel crushed. I felt clear. Because for the first time, I wasn't just seeing myself as David's mother, the provider, the protector, the woman who did everything right. I was seeing myself as a woman who made mistakes. A woman shaped by her own quiet mother who smiled at dinner tables and cried only in locked bathrooms. A woman who had confused silence with strength. A woman who had taught her son to hold everything in because that's what she had done for decades. Later that morning, I went to the hall closet and pulled down a cardboard box labeled David Elementary School. It had been collecting dust for years. Inside were drawings, notes, birthday cards, school awards. I sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by crayons and construction paper memories. There was one picture, one I didn't remember, of the two of us beneath a tree. David had drawn us both smiling. My figure was tall and straight with my hair tied in the usual bun. He was small beside me, holding my hand. But his feet weren't touching the ground. I stared at it, heart pounding. He hadn't drawn a shadow for himself. Just a floating boy next to a grounded mother. Had he felt untethered? Had he felt like he didn't belong to the earth we stood on together? Or had I taught him that to stay grounded meant not expressing too much, not asking for too much? That image sat in my chest like a stone. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and called Kira. I didn't know exactly what I planned to say. I just knew I needed to say something. When she answered, her voice was hesitant. "Eleanor, hi," I said. "I wanted to thank you." There was a long pause. "For what?" "For noticing," I said. "For loving him enough to see what I didn't. And for saying it even when it wasn't easy." Her voice softened. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't," I replied. "But the truth did. And I think maybe I needed it." Another silence. This one warmer. Then almost shyly she said, "He's been better since the conversation. Lighter. Like he's finally breathing." I felt something break and bloom inside me at once. Then I'm glad I whispered. Even if it took this long. That night I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't fill the room with background noise to drown the weight of my thoughts. Instead, I lit a single candle on the table, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat in the quiet. And I said something out loud I had never said before. I want to know my son. Again. Not the child I remember. Not the boy I raised. But the man he is now, with his bruises and beauty, his disappointments and desires, his silence and his truths. And I want him to know me too. Not the image I worked so hard to project, but the woman underneath, flawed, unfinished, willing to grow. Because maybe being a good mother isn't about being unbreakable. Maybe it's about being brave enough to admit when you've already broken something and choosing to show up anyway. It happened at a dinner I hadn't even wanted to host. Kira had suggested it a week earlier, a casual evening, just the four of us. Me, her David, and their daughter Ava. Nothing formal, she'd said with a smile. Just a little family time. But I knew what she was doing. Kira had always been subtle like that, gracious on the surface, strategic underneath. This dinner wasn't about family bonding. It was a stage, a setup. And the moment we sat down at the table, I could feel it, the pressure, the waiting. Like everyone knew there was something unsaid hanging in the air. David carved the chicken carefully, avoiding my eyes. Ava was unusually quiet, playing with the hem of her napkin. Kira poured wine into our glasses with an elegance that felt rehearsed. I offered the salad, said something about the weather, tried to smooth the edges, but the silence after each of my sentences was deafening. It was as if they were all waiting for a different script. A different version of me. Then it happened. So Ava, Kira said brightly, placing her napkin neatly in her lap. "Remember what we talked about with Grandma last week, About how sometimes grown-ups don't always show their feelings on the outside, Ava nodded shyly. She was only 8. That's right, Kira continued. Some people grew up in homes where no one talked about emotions. So even when they feel things, they might not say them out loud. David froze his fork hovering midair. I went cold. Kira turned to me not aggressively, not unkindly, but with a disarming smile that held more weight than her words. You know what I mean, Eleanor. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Deliberately, sweetly, publicly. She had just made me the object lesson, the emotionally unavailable matriarch in front of my granddaughter. I set down my glass, slowly trying to keep my voice even. Kira, that's a complicated topic for a child to grasp over dinner. She tilted her head. I think children understand more than we give them credit for. Ava looked down at her plate. David stared straight ahead. And in that moment, I felt completely, utterly outnumbered, not by aggression, but by consensus. A quiet agreement that I was the emotionally restrained one. The problem. The wound passed down through generations now being corrected in real time. I'd never felt so exposed in my own home. I wasn't raised to talk about feelings at the dinner table, I said calmly, folding my napkin in my lap. But that doesn't mean I don't have them. No one said you didn't, Kira replied softly. We're just learning to name them out loud. For Ava's sake. The words hung there, almost innocent but cutting like glass. For Ava's sake. As if I were the one who endangered her. As if my quiet nature were something to be filtered out of her upbringing like secondhand smoke. David cleared his throat. Maybe we could change the subject. But it was too late. The moment had already sunk its claws into me. The rest of dinner passed in hollow conversation recipes, Ava's school projects, the new neighbors. Kira smiled through all of it. David nodded. Ava excused herself early. When the plates were cleared and they said goodbye, I stood in the doorway and watched them walk to the car. Kira's hand slipped into David's as they reached the driveway. They didn't look back. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't really want. The room still smelled faintly of rosemary chicken. The chairs were still warm. But something had changed. I realized something important. Kira wasn't trying to humiliate me. She was trying to reframe me in her daughter's eyes. She wanted Ava to grow up in a house where words like sad and angry and hurt weren't swallowed. She wanted to undo what she believed had been done to David. She didn't see me as a threat. She saw me as a pattern. And she had every intention of breaking it. Part of me hated her for it. But another part, the part that had stayed awake the night before, crying into a blank notebook, understood her completely. If I had known better back then, I might have done the same. Still, it hurt. Deeply. Not just the insinuation, but the method. To be framed as emotionally deficient in front of a child I loved, a child who saw me as her soft-spoken, story-reading, cookie-baking grandma that felt cruel, even if unintentional. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister. Her name was Linda. 3 years older. We hadn't been close in decades. Too many differences. Too many silences. But that night I needed someone who knew where I came from. And Linda did. When she answered, her voice cracked, slightly surprised, but not unkind. I wanted to ask you something, I said after the pleasantries faded. When we were kids. Did Mom ever hug you? There was a long pause. No, she said. Not really. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't reachable. We sat in the shared quiet. I think I became her, I admitted. Without meaning to. You became the soft version of her, Linda said. But yes, I see what you mean. Her honesty didn't hurt. It landed like truth, solid, undeniable. We spoke for another hour. About how love had looked like control. How protection had meant silence. How survival had meant keeping your feelings folded tight. When we hung up, I felt like I'd touched a root of something. Something old. Something deep. And I knew I could only cut the pattern if I named it, if I admitted it, even when it made me bleed. The next morning, I didn't make coffee. That might sound like a small thing, but for me, it wasn't. I always started my day the same way. Same mug, same spoon, same seat at the window. Routine had always been my armor. But on this morning, my hands hovered over the pot, then dropped to my sides. I couldn't do it. The routine felt hollow, mechanical, like putting on a costume after the stage lights had gone out. Instead, I sat in silence. No television, no radio, no soft music in the background. Just me. And the echo of everything I hadn't said for decades. What was so wrong about the way I'd raised David? Why did it now feel like I was on trial in my own life? Not for what I did, but for what I didn't do. The answer came like a whisper, because I'd built a house out of absence. Gentle, polished, well-intentioned absence. I had built it from my own childhood. I still remember the first time I tried to cry in front of my mother. I was 12, maybe 13. My best friend had moved away without warning. No goodbye, no letter. Just an empty seat at lunch. I came home, sat at the kitchen table, and tears began rolling down my cheeks without sound. My mother looked up from her crossword puzzle. She didn't flinch, didn't rush over. She folded the paper, slowly walked to the fridge, and poured me a glass of milk. Here, she said, setting it down in front of me. You're overtired. Have a drink. Take a nap. You'll feel better. That was her version of love. And I learned right then sadness wasn't something you shared. It was something you cleaned up. I pulled down an old parenting book from the shelf in my hallway, one I'd clung to when David was still in preschool. I had highlighted and underlined like a woman studying for a final exam in motherhood. It was full of strategies, rules, theories. Provide structure. Limit emotional indulgence. Children thrive in predictability. None of it mentioned what to do when your child simply wanted to be seen. I flipped through the pages, seeing not advice, but echoes of my younger self trying so desperately not to make mistakes that I forgot children weren't puzzles to solve. They were people. Feeling aching, scared little people who needed more than systems and schedules. They needed you raw, vulnerable, available. I had built a flawless routine around David, but I never let him see me. That afternoon, I found a dusty photo album tucked behind some board games in the hallway closet. One I hadn't opened in years. Page after page, David in various stages of life, his first Halloween braces on his teeth, high school graduation. He looked happy. But now I saw something beneath that happiness, like a shadow in the corner of every frame. Was it longing? Was it a quiet ache? Or was it my own projection? There was one photo that froze me, David around 9, sitting at the kitchen table with a science project in front of him. He was beaming at the camera, a volcano made of paper maché at his side. But what caught me was my own face in the background. I wasn't looking at him. I was on the phone, laughing, distracted. And he was still smiling even without my eyes on him. That smile haunted me. It was the smile of a child who had already learned not to expect more. I needed to talk to someone, but not Kira. Not yet. So I called Maggie, an old friend from my teaching days. She was the only person who had known me before David, before marriage, before life had hardened into performance. Eleanor, she said, when she picked up her voice warm and surprised. Is everything all right? I don't know, I admitted. I think I failed as a mother. There was a pause. Oh, sweetheart, that's a big thing to carry. I told her everything. Not just about the dinner or what David said. I told her about the memories, the routines, the years I thought I was doing everything right. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, her voice came through like a balm. You didn't fail, she said. You protected. You planned. You gave him a version of love you were taught to believe was safe, but now you see that it wasn't enough, and that's where the courage begins. Courage. I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe owning your mistakes wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the bravest thing a mother could do. That night, I sat down at my desk with a new notebook, and I began to write a letter. Not to David. Not yet. To myself. Dear Eleanor, you did the best you could with the tools you were given, but the blueprint you followed was flawed. You confused silence for calm control for care. You didn't know any better. But now you do. And now you will do better. I signed it. I dated it. I closed the notebook and held it in my lap. This was my first apology. Not for being evil or cold, but for being unfinished. Before I went to bed, I walked through the house and looked at everything as if I were seeing it for the first time. The framed family photos on the wall, the silence in the hallway, the dent in the corner of the sofa where David used to sit reading comic books. I whispered something into the empty space. I see you now. I didn't know if I meant David or myself. Maybe both. The next day, David called. Not a text. Not a voice memo. A real call with his voice trembling just enough to make my stomach twist. Hey, Mom, he said almost cautiously. Are you free to talk? Like, in person? There was a pause where I could hear him inhale as if bracing for rejection. Yes, I answered immediately. Of course I am. I can stop by after work. He didn't say what it was about. He didn't have to. After we hung up, I sat very still. Something had shifted subtly but unmistakably. It wasn't just his tone. It was the way he asked. There was vulnerability in it, but also something else. A kind of nervous courage. I spent the next few hours tidying the house without thinking. Folding throws, dusting shelves, rearranging teacups that didn't need rearranging. It wasn't about making things look nice. It was about making space. Not just in the house, but in me. For him. For the version of him I still hadn't fully met. He arrived just before 6, still in his work clothes, button-up shirt, slightly wrinkled sleeves, rolled. He looked tired but determined, like a man who'd rehearsed this conversation on his drive over. I made tea, though neither of us touched it. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table just like we had during the conversation that cracked everything open. Only this time his posture was more upright. And mine. Softer. I've been thinking a lot, he began. I waited. I've been going to therapy again, he said. Regularly this time. Not just when things get bad. I nodded, my throat tightening. I'm glad. And Kira's been... Well, she's been helping me talk about stuff. Stuff I've ignored for a long time. I didn't flinch. I wanted to. I wanted to defend myself, to offer context, but I stayed quiet. He studied my face, then looked down at his hands. There were times I felt like I was walking around with a backpack full of bricks, and I didn't even know why it was heavy. Just that it always was. I exhaled. Quietly. Slowly. I've carried those bricks too, I said. That got his attention. He looked up. I didn't realize how much I had packed into you. I continued. Expectations, silences, a standard of being okay all the time. I thought I was helping you stay strong, but I was really just teaching you not to need me. His eyes shimmered. He didn't cry, not yet, but the emotion was close. You didn't yell, he said. You didn't hit. You didn't shame me. No, I replied, but I also didn't hold space for your fears, your sadness. I think I was too afraid of seeing my own. A silence passed between us, but this one didn't feel sharp or distant. It felt full of truth, full of breath. He looked down again, voice quieter now. Kira said something the other day that I didn't want to hear at first, but I think it's true. What did she say? She said I spent my childhood performing emotional balance, not actually feeling it. I closed my eyes, That one landed hard, because it was true. He had smiled on cue. He had reassured me. He had never been the child who threw tantrums or asked to be held too long. And I had mistaken that for maturity. But it was training. Invisible training I had never meant to enforce. I opened my eyes again. I want to do better, I told him. I want to show up now as I am. Not the version of me that was trying so hard to be perfect. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I believe you. I hadn't realized how much I needed those 3 words until they landed. We sat in the living room after that. No agenda, no therapy talk, just being. I noticed the way his knee bounced slightly when he talked, how his hands moved when he got passionate. The little things, the kind of details you miss when you only focus on the big picture of motherhood. He told me about a new project at work, a book Ava was reading, a dumb show Kira loved that he couldn't stand but watched anyway. And I just listened, really listened, not with judgment, not with correction, not with suggestions, but with the open heart of someone who finally realized the value of simply witnessing. Before he left, he stood at the door, keys in hand, and looked back at me. You know, he said, I used to think you didn't notice when I was hurting. I held his gaze. I noticed. I just didn't know what to do with it. He nodded slowly. Well, we're learning. Yes, I said. We are. He hugged me. Tightly. Longer than usual. When the door closed behind him, I didn't cry. I just stood there holding the warmth of that hug in my arms like a gift I never thought I'd get back. Later that night, I pulled out the letter I'd written to myself. I added a line at the bottom just beneath my signature. There's still time. Because there was. Maybe not to rewrite the early years, maybe not to fix every bruise or answer every unasked question, but there was still time to be real, time to be open, time to be present. And in this chapter of our lives, presence would be the most radical love I could offer. It wasn't long before Kira invited me to lunch. Just the 2 of us. No David, no Ava, no emotional buffer. She chose a quiet cafe, modern sunlit with whitewashed walls and little rosemary plants in terracotta pots on each table. It was the kind of place where conversations could stretch out without judgment, where silence felt curated, not awkward. I arrived early. That's my nature. Kira walked in precisely on time, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. She wore a beige linen blouse and sat across from me like she was preparing for a negotiation, not a meal. I braced myself for what might come, but the first thing she said was not what I expected. David told me about your talk. I didn't reply immediately. I studied her face, searching for disdain, suspicion, the careful calculation I often assumed lived behind her eyes. But I saw something else this time. Relief. Maybe even cautious hope. He said you listened, she continued. Really listened. I did, I said softly. I finally understood something I'd spent years refusing to see. Kira exhaled almost like she'd been holding her breath since the day she married into our family. That means a lot, she said. To him and to me. There was a moment of mutual stillness. The past floated between us like dust in the sunlight, not erased, not forgotten, but suspended. I reached for my water, unsure how much to say, how much I had a right to say. But she didn't wait. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I probably should have told you a long time ago. I leaned in, slightly alert. Years ago, she began, when David and I were still dating, he had a breakdown. Not a dramatic one. Not something that landed him in a hospital. But it was real. He shut down. Couldn't get out of bed for days. Didn't return calls. He told me it was just burnout from work, but I knew it was more. I nodded slowly. And you thought? It came from how he was raised. She hesitated. I thought it came from years of holding it in, of being the strong one, The good one. The one who didn't need anyone. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Because I had built that framework. Brick by brick. And I blamed you. She admitted, her voice lower now. Quietly. Privately. I told myself you were emotionally rigid. That you created the kind of man who didn't know how to fall apart safely. I swallowed the sting. It wasn't news. But hearing it said aloud so plainly without malice brought a flush of grief I hadn't prepared for. I probably did, I said. Not on purpose. But still. She looked surprised. Maybe she expected defensiveness. A rational argument. A list of generational wounds I could use to shield myself. But I was done hiding behind legacy. I was raised to prize silence, I continued. To believe that holding everything in made you mature, that asking for comfort made you weak. I passed that down because I didn't know any other way, but I do now. Kira's eyes glistened. That's all I ever wanted, Eleanor. Not an apology, just the acknowledgement, the understanding. There it was. The crack in the wall we had built between us. It had been there for years, decorated with politeness, covered in smiles, but it had never come down until now. After lunch, we walked together down the street. It was unseasonably warm for spring, the breeze sweet with the scent of blooming wisteria. We passed a bookstore and she paused in front of the window, pointing to a title. Ava's reading that, she said. She keeps saying it reminds her of you. I raised an eyebrow. Really, it's about a grandmother who speaks softly but knows everything. She writes letters to her granddaughter in secret, hiding them in books. I laughed gently. I've never written Ava a letter. Maybe you should, Kira said. The invitation was quiet but unmistakable. A bridge. That evening, I sat at my writing desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. I didn't overthink it. I didn't try to make it poetic or profound. I just wrote, Dear Ava. When you were a baby, I used to hum to you while you napped on my chest. You probably don't remember, but I do. You smelled like milk and sunshine. I haven't always been good at saying how I feel. I'm learning. But I want you to know you make my heart grow every time I see you. You are bright and brave and everything I never knew I needed. I'm proud of you. I love you. Always. Love, Grandma. I folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and tucked it inside the cover of a book. I knew she'd enjoy a collection of animal tales with soft illustrations and little poems between chapters. I planned to give it to her the next time she came over. Not as a gift, but as a seed. Because relationships, especially those we're trying to rebuild, grow from the smallest gestures. And this was my beginning. Later that night, David texted me a photo. It was Ava curled up on the couch holding a mug of cocoa and flipping through a book. She was smiling. The caption read, She says this one smells like your house. I stared at the image for a long time, not because of what she was reading, but because of what it meant. She felt safe in something that reminded her of me, not the idea of me, not the history of me. Me now. The next time Ava visited, she came running through the front door like nothing had ever changed. Grandma, she called, her shoes thudding against the hardwood as she dropped her backpack by the door and flung her arms around my waist. It was the kind of hug that didn't ask for permission, the kind that came from instinct, not performance. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her cheek against my stomach, and something inside me, something brittle and ancient, softened. She smelled like strawberries and library books. I crouched to her level, brushing her hair back. I have something for you, I said. She gasped with theatrical delight even before she knew what it was. I handed her the book, the one with the letter hidden inside, and her eyes lit up like I'd given her a box of treasure. What is it, you'll see, I said. But don't read the first page until you're alone. It's a secret just for you. Her grin stretched wide. She loved secrets. She hugged the book to her chest like it was made of gold, And in a way it was. It was the first time I had given her more than cookies or crafts or polite conversation. It was a part of me, unfiltered, unmasked, unafraid. That evening, after she'd gone to her room to read and David had disappeared into the backyard with a rake, I stood in the kitchen with Kira. We didn't speak at first. We didn't need to. She was washing dishes. I was drying. Our rhythm was easy, domestic. For the first time, it didn't feel forced. "I want to thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above the hum of the faucet. Kira glanced at me, surprised. "For what? For not giving up on me?" She paused, hands still wet, her brow softening. "I was never trying to replace you," she said. "I just wanted David to feel safe being fully himself. And I wanted Ava to grow up knowing it's okay to cry, to need, to speak." I nodded slowly. "I see that now." She returned to the dishes and after a moment added, "And I see you're changing. Really changing." I blinked, not expecting the weight of that compliment. "You're letting people in, Eleanor," she said. "That's a gift. For David. For Ava. For all of us." Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and she didn't hide it. We were two women raised in different decades with different maps of what motherhood meant. But somehow, we had reached the same shore. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, I found a sticky note on my nightstand. Ava's handwriting. Messy, lopsided, beautiful. "Grandma," I read the letter. "I love you so much. I think you're magic." I pressed it to my chest. Then I cried. Not the silent, controlled tears I had mastered. Real tears. Warm, grateful, unapologetic. I cried for the woman I used to be, so afraid of saying the wrong thing she often said nothing at all. I cried for the boy David had been smiling without asking for more. And I cried for the child now upstairs, Ava, who would never have to wonder if her feelings were too much, too messy, too inconvenient. She would know they mattered, because I would make sure she did. The next week, I started therapy again. It had been decades since I'd sat across from a stranger and admitted I wasn't okay. But this time was different. I didn't go to fix myself. I went to understand the parts of me I had abandoned. My therapist, a woman named Jolene with kind eyes and a sharp memory, asked me in the second session, "What's your earliest memory of needing comfort and not receiving it?" And without hesitation, I said, "Age 10. My dog died. I cried in the garage because I didn't want to make my mother uncomfortable." Jolene nodded gently. "And what did you learn about your own grief that day?" "That it was private," I said. "That love wasn't loud. That emotions made people look away." She wrote something down, and I let her. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel judged. I felt seen. Week after week, I kept going. And each time I walked out of that office, I felt a little lighter. Not healed, that would take longer. Maybe a lifetime. But I was learning that motherhood didn't end when your child grew up. It evolved. And maybe my most important work wasn't in raising David. Maybe it was in unlearning what I had passed down. In becoming the kind of mother and now grandmother who could walk into a room and say, "I don't have all the answers, but I'm here, and I care, and I'll stay." That kind of presence. It's louder than any lesson. It's stronger than any silence. One afternoon, David came by to help me fix a leaky faucet. It was nothing urgent, just an excuse to see each other, I think. He crouched under the sink, muttering to himself about washers and pressure valves, while I stood nearby holding a flashlight and pretending to know what I was doing. At one point, he looked up at me and said, "You've changed the air in this house, you know." I blinked. "What do you mean?" It used to feel like I had to be on my best behavior here. Like if I wasn't happy or polite, I was wrong. And now, he grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. Now it just feels like home. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I said. "No," he replied. "Thank you?" And in that simple exchange, I felt something settle. The ache I'd been carrying, the shame, the regret, the fear that I'd lost my son, it loosened. Because I hadn't lost him. I had found him. And maybe he had found me too. The shift when it came didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in gently through warm moments, small gestures and breaths that didn't feel so heavy anymore. At first, I noticed it in David's texts. They no longer read like formal check-ins or logistical updates about Ava's school calendar. They had texture thought, and something else I hadn't seen in years, emotional presence. "Hey mom, just wondering how your afternoon is going." Or, "You mentioned a book the other day, the one about family patterns, I think I want to read it." It was as if we were starting over. From scratch. But this time, he wasn't building a wall to protect himself from me. He was inviting me into his emotional world, one word at a time. Then there was Kira. She began to ask if I'd like to pick Ava up from school sometimes. She would add a soft, almost embarrassed smile and say, "Only if it's not too much." But I knew this wasn't about obligation. This was trust. The real breakthrough came one evening when Ava curled beside me on the couch. We were watching some old cartoon she loved, and I hadn't said much. I was just there. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "I like when you're quiet, Grandma. It feels peaceful." That made me blink. For so long, I'd feared my quiet nature was a flaw, a failure passed down from my own mother. But here, it was the very thing I used to feel ashamed of now being named as a gift. And for once, I accepted it. Not everything had to be loud to matter. One Sunday, David invited me to brunch with them. A small cafe in the city, nothing fancy but cheerful and sunny with checkered tablecloths and a chalkboard menu filled with misspelled pastries. We sat at a table by the window. Ava munched on pancakes shaped like animals. Kira drank iced tea and talked about a yoga studio she was thinking of trying. David was relaxed. His shoulders no longer hunched, his laugh less guarded. I studied them as they interacted. Not to measure myself against them or to interpret their happiness, but to witness it. Fully. Without jealousy or regret. And somewhere between the second cup of coffee and the final bite of omelet, I realized something almost unbearable in its beauty. I didn't feel like a guest at their table anymore. I felt like family again, not just in name, not as a role filled by tradition or convenience, but truly deeply included. Not because I had done everything right, but because I had stayed. Because I had chosen not to defend my mistakes, but to confront them. Because I had looked at my past and said, I can't change what I didn't know, but I can change what I do next. And that mattered. When I got home that afternoon, the house didn't feel as hollow. The silence wasn't accusatory anymore. It was restful. I stood in my kitchen, the same room where I'd once stared at the wall, wondering what had gone so terribly wrong, and saw it differently now. This was the place where the healing had started, where I had faced the truth about myself and found the courage to write that first letter to Ava, where I had made space for uncomfortable conversations and survived them, where I had let go of the need to be seen as the good mother, and instead became a present one. I thought about all the years I spent in waiting for an invitation to rejoin my own child's life, waiting for forgiveness. I wasn't brave enough to ask for waiting for time to reverse itself and give me another shot at mothering. But waiting had kept me frozen. It was showing up that changed everything. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I lit a candle, poured a cup of tea, and opened my journal. On a clean page, I wrote, I am not the mother I once was. I am not the silence I inherited. I am not the absence I passed on. I am becoming, and that is enough. Then I closed the book and simply sat. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole, not in a perfect way, but in a peaceful one. Wholeness, I was learning, doesn't mean you've fixed everything. It means you've stopped running from it and started holding it with care. A few days later, I bumped into my neighbor Ruth while watering the porch plants. She's known me for over 20 years, from PTA meetings to quiet walks around the block. "You seem lighter lately," she said, squinting against the sun. I smiled, caught off guard. "Do I?" She nodded, like someone let go of something heavy. I paused watering can, tilting forward a little too far. "I think I finally stopped pretending I didn't care," I said quietly, "and started actually caring without needing to be right." She didn't respond with platitudes. She just gave me a slow nod, the kind older women exchange when words can't hold the full weight of what's understood. Later that night, I thought about that moment. How strange and beautiful it was to be seen, not for who I had tried to be, but for who I was becoming. It reminded me that the work I'd done, the forgiveness I'd sought, the presence I'd practiced, hadn't just affected my son or Ava or Kira. It had changed me, and that perhaps was the quietest miracle of all. The real test came the night David showed up at my door unannounced. It was raining, not a gentle drizzle, but a steady soaking downpour that clung to his jacket and dripped from his hairline. He looked like a man who had come straight from somewhere he hadn't planned to leave, and somewhere he didn't want to return to. I opened the door and didn't speak. He stepped inside, shoulders slumped, eyes puffy. I took his coat, offered a towel, and led him to the living room. For a while he just sat there, silent, so still it hurt to watch. I waited. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't press. I'd learned by now that silence is not always absence, sometimes it's space. And he needed space. Eventually his voice cracked the air between us. "Kira and I had a fight." I nodded slowly. She said, "I still go quiet when I feel hurt. That I don't let her in. That I disappear in front of her." He rubbed his palms together, a nervous, boyish habit I hadn't seen in years. "And she's right," he added. My breath caught. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew deep in my bones that this was the moment I had feared for decades, the confirmation that he had learned his emotional withdrawal, not from life, but from me. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He looked up. "Why are you apologizing? Because I taught you how to disappear." There it was. No padding, no metaphor. Just the truth laid bare between us. He didn't argue. He didn't absolve me. But he didn't look away either. "I used to think being calm made me strong," he said. "Like if I didn't cry, if I didn't yell, it meant I was handling it. But lately, I feel like I'm drowning in everything I've never said out loud." I moved closer, not to fix it, not to guide, just to be near. "Maybe drowning isn't the end," I said. "Maybe it's how you finally learn to reach." He smiled faintly, his eyes glassy. "That sounds like something from one of those journals you keep." I smiled too. "Maybe it is." He sighed. "I want to do better. Not just for Kira. For myself. For Ava." "You already are," I said. "You're here. That's the hardest part." We sat for a long time watching the rain smear the windows. I brewed him tea, the kind he liked as a child, black with honey and a splash of milk. He sipped it slowly, holding the mug like an anchor. "I remember this," he said, the steam curling into his voice. "You used to bring it to me when I was sick. You never said much. Just left it on the nightstand." I laughed gently. "That was my way of saying, 'I love you.'" He nodded. "I know. But I think I needed the words too." That landed. Not like an accusation, but like a missed step you finally trace back. "I'm learning to say them now," I said. Out loud. Even if my voice shakes. He smiled, and for a moment we sat in the warmth of that shared ache, the generations of silence, the broken inheritance of quiet strength. By the time he left, the rain had slowed to a whisper. He hugged me tightly, resting his chin on my shoulder like he hadn't since he was a teenager. And as I closed the door behind him, I didn't cry. I simply stood there, heart full, breath steady. Because this was what love looked like in real life. Not perfection, not poetry, but presence, recovery, the willingness to return even after you've fled. The next morning, I woke up early. The house was still. Light leaked through the blinds in thin gold ribbons. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled down one of my journals, not the new ones, but an old one I hadn't opened in years. Inside, I found a page marked with a torn corner, a letter I'd written but never sent. Dear David, if I seem cold, it's because I was raised in winter. If I seem quiet, it's because I never learned the language of emotion. But I want you to know I see you. I have always seen you. And I am trying every day to thaw. I had written it during one of his first college breaks when he seemed so distant, but I didn't know how to ask why. I folded the page and slipped it into an envelope. This time I would give it to him. Not because I owed him the past, but because we both deserved the truth of what had always been buried there. That evening, I left the letter on his porch with a new jar of honey and a note, just in case the words still matter. Love, Mom. No reply came that night, but the next afternoon I received a single text from David. Thank you. I read it out loud. Twice. I held the phone in my hands for a long time, not because I needed more, but because I finally understood something vital. Healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it hums in the quiet return of someone you thought you'd lost, someone who stands in your kitchen at midnight drenched in rain and says, I'm still here. And you say, so am I. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Ava asked me a question that stopped me cold. We were in the garden kneeling beside a patch of drooping marigolds. Her small hands were busy digging in the soil while I trimmed the browning leaves with a pair of worn clippers. Grandma, she said, not looking up. Did my dad ever cry when he was little? I paused mid-snip. She turned toward me, dirt smudged across her cheek, eyes wide, not with judgment but with the kind of innocent curiosity that only children are brave enough to voice. I mean, she added softly, I don't really see him cry now. So, did he? I sat back on my heels, my hands resting in my lap. That single question opened up an entire room in my memory I hadn't entered in years. Yes, I said finally, but not very often. Why not? I thought about it. I could have given her the simple answer that boys were raised differently back then, that we didn't know better, but I owed her more than that. Because I didn't teach him how I said. I didn't show him it was okay. Her eyebrows drew together. Did you cry when you were little? I let out a breath. No, I was taught not to. That crying made you weak. That quiet meant strong. And so, I passed that on to your dad. Ava's fingers went still in the soil. But that's not true. Crying is okay. I smiled, a little heartbroken and a lot proud. You're right. It took me a long time to learn that. She leaned forward and placed a tiny seedling in the ground. Her movements were slow and careful, like she was cradling something fragile. I think Daddy cries on the inside, she said. Sometimes I can feel it. Her words, so tender, so instinctual, reached a part of me no adult ever had. You're probably right, I whispered. But maybe one day he won't have to cry on the inside anymore. She nodded solemnly, like we had made a pact. Then, without ceremony, she stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans. Can I have a popsicle now? I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the weight of the moment had lifted as quickly as it arrived. Children are magical like that. They walk us into our truth, and then skip away towards sweetness. That night I sat down with an old photo album. Page after page there was David, gap-toothed, awkward, full of light. In one photo he was holding a kite, grinning into the wind. In another he was building a Lego spaceship, tongue sticking out in fierce concentration. But in most of the photos something was missing. He was alone. I was often the one behind the camera, chronicling his childhood with meticulous detail, but rarely in it. I had been present in the room, but absent from the memory. smiling through distance. And suddenly, I realized the cruel irony. I had tried so hard to capture his life that I had forgotten to share mine with him. The next morning, I called David. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. I was thinking about something Ava asked me yesterday." I heard him shuffle, probably sitting upright. "What did she ask, if you ever cried as a child?" Silence. Then, "What did you say?" I told her you did, but not often. And I told her the truth, that I didn't make it feel safe for you to cry. He didn't respond right away. "I'm sorry," I said again, softer now. "Not because I think it will fix the past, but because you deserved better." I heard a slow inhale on the other end. "Thanks," he said finally. "That means more than I can explain." We sat in the quiet together, the lines still open, our breaths syncopated. "She's a good kid," I said. "She is," he agreed. "She knows things we didn't." David chuckled lightly. "She teaches me more than I teach her some days." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Maybe that's the point. Maybe our children are here to heal us just as much as we're here to raise them. His voice cracked, barely audible. "You know, I wish we'd had conversations like this when I was younger." "Me too," I said. "But I think we're having them now, and maybe that's what matters most." That weekend, they all came over for dinner. I cooked pot roast, the kind David used to love but never asked for anymore. Kira brought wine. Ava brought a new picture she'd drawn. It was us in the garden, surrounded by marigolds and tiny hearts. She had drawn herself holding a watering can, and me beside her, smiling. In her world, we were always tending to something. And maybe we were. After dinner, while clearing the plates, David put his hand on my shoulder. Not casual, intentional. "You're doing a good job, Mom," he said. "Now. Here. With us." I looked at him. Really looked. And I saw not just my son, but a man still learning, still bending toward the light. And I saw a reflection of myself in that, older, humbler, but stronger in all the right ways. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means everything." Later, when they left and the house grew quiet again, I didn't feel the old loneliness. I felt complete. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had faced it. And somewhere in the garden, new marigolds were already starting to bloom. It had been years since I let someone see me cry. But one morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the quiet, it happened. Not with a dramatic sob or a sudden collapse, but with a slow, soft unraveling. I was reading a message from David. It was a photo of Ava holding a handmade card. The front said, "To Grandma who listens." Inside, she had drawn a heart, a flower, and a sentence in her careful handwriting. "Thank you for hearing my small voice." That's when the tears came. Because that phrase, "my small voice," was everything I hadn't allowed myself to have as a child, everything I had unknowingly withheld from David. I placed the phone on the counter and wept. I wept not from sorrow, but from release. It was a quiet reckoning, an acknowledgement that something in me had finally shifted. Not all at once, but deeply. A letting go. Of guilt. Of the long self-judgment. Of the belief that I was too late. That afternoon, I decided to visit my sister Marianne. We hadn't spoken much since our mother's funeral 5 years ago. Too many differences. Too many years of tiptoeing around old wounds and unspoken resentments. But lately, I'd been thinking about those early years, the cold house, the silences passed off as strength, the way we both learned to hide feelings like dangerous glass. I called her first. "Marianne," I said, voice trembling slightly. "I've been doing some work on myself, and I think I'd like to talk to you." There was a pause. Then she said, "I've been waiting for that." When I arrived at her modest home across town, I felt strangely nervous. We sat on her porch, rocking chairs, mugs of tea, late-day light soaking through the branches. I studied her face. It had aged, yes, but so had mine. And beneath the lines were traces of the same little girls who used to whisper in the dark, who made blanket forts and shared secrets about our parents we didn't know how to name. "I think Mom loved us," she said after a while. "She just didn't know how to show it." I nodded. "And I didn't know how to give what I never received." She glanced at me. "But you're giving it now, right?" That struck me. I hadn't thought of it that way, that by learning to mother differently now, I wasn't just rewriting my story, but ours. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." We sat quietly after that, the kind of silence that no longer felt sharp. A silence of understanding, not avoidance. Before I left, she hugged me. And not the stiff kind we used to exchange out of politeness, but a real one. One that said, "I missed you. I forgive you. We're still here." In the weeks that followed, I started a new ritual. Every Sunday, I would write Ava a letter, sometimes about my childhood, sometimes about her father when he was young, sometimes about small things: the color of the sky, the smell of basil, the music I heard at the grocery store. I called them truth notes. Not big lessons, not moral teachings, just honest pieces of me. She kept them in a box under her bed, Kira told me. Said she liked to read them before going to sleep. I pictured her there, little hands unfolding my words, heart absorbing what I never said to her father, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the kind built on fantasy, but the real kind. The kind born from hard-earned change and imperfect love. One Saturday, while Ava was helping me in the kitchen, she looked up and asked, "What are you most proud of, Grandma?" I froze, holding a wooden spoon in midair. For a moment, I wanted to say something impressive, some achievement, some milestone. But instead, I looked into her eyes and told the truth. I'm proud that I didn't give up. On myself. Or on the people I love. She nodded like that made perfect sense to her 8-year-old heart. Then she asked, "Does that mean you're proud of Dad too?" I smiled. "Oh yes. Especially him." She leaned in and whispered, "Me too." And in that instant, I saw a bridge not made of stone or steel, but of choices of healing, of love, passed gently from hand to hand. A bridge between past and future, built not by perfection, but by persistence. That night, I wrote one more note for Ava's box. Short. Simple. The bravest thing I ever did was tell the truth first to myself, then to the people I loved. If you ever wonder what strength looks like, look in the mirror. You are the proof that healing is real. I signed it with a small drawing of a flower, a marigold, because some seeds bloom long after they're planted. A week before Ava's 9th birthday, I was invited to her class for Family Heritage Day. Each student could bring a grandparent or relative to share stories, photos, and traditions from their family's history. At first, I hesitated. Public speaking had never been my strength, especially when it involved something as vulnerable as my past. But Ava's eyes lit up when she asked me, "Please, Grandma, I want you to come. Everyone will love your stories." And just like that, I found myself saying yes. That night, I rummaged through old boxes in the attic. Yellowing photo albums, brittle letters, newspaper clippings. I hadn't touched most of them in decades. My fingers shook as I opened one album in particular, the one with David's childhood photos mixed in with images of my own parents. There was a photo of my mother I hadn't looked at in years, stern-pressed lips, arms crossed. I stared at her for a long time, wondering who she had been before she'd become so guarded. What had happened in her life to make her afraid of tenderness? Then in the back of the album, I found something surprising, a picture I didn't remember taking. It was me holding David when he was a baby. He was asleep on my chest, and I was looking down at him. My face wasn't cold. It was soft, full of awe. That single image undid something in me. I had loved him deeply, even back then. I just hadn't always known how to show it. The day of the school visit arrived. I wore a blue cardigan, Ava liked the one with the little embroidered birds. She held my hand as we walked into the classroom, proudly announcing, "This is my grandma Eleanor. She's really good at remembering things." The teacher smiled and the children gathered on the carpet legs, crossed eyes wide. I cleared my throat, my heart pounding. "I want to tell you a story." I began not just about where our family comes from, but about how we learn to grow even when we've forgotten how. I spoke slowly, showing them pictures my parents as children, my grandparents from overseas, David as a boy building forts and riding bikes. Then I paused. "There's something else I want to share," I said. "Sometimes families carry silence. Sometimes we forget how to talk about hard feelings. But in our family, we're learning to be braver, to speak more, to listen better." One little girl raised her hand. "Was that hard for you?" I smiled gently. "Yes. But the best things often are." After the talk, Ava hugged me tight. "You were the best one," she whispered in my ear. And I believed her. Not because I had been eloquent, but because I had been real. A few days later, David came by to pick up Ava. He lingered a bit in the living room, eyeing the photo of him as a baby I'd recently placed on the shelf. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In an old album," I said. I forgot how much I smiled back then. He looked closer. "You always looked tired in my memory. But here you look peaceful." I said. In that moment at least. "I think I was just afraid it wouldn't last." He turned toward me. "Do you still feel that way?" I took a breath. "No, because I know now that love doesn't vanish. It just waits. Sometimes it waits a long time, but it never disappears." He nodded as if absorbing that for himself. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I've started therapy again." I blinked. "Oh." He nodded. "I realize there's still so much I haven't unpacked about my childhood, my fears, even about how I parent Ava." I stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "That's the bravest thing you could do, David." He looked down. "You started this, you know. You opened the door." Tears welled in my eyes. "And you walked through it." That night I sat by the window watching dusk fold over the neighborhood. Somewhere down the street, wind chimes clinked gently and the scent of jasmine drifted through the open pane. I thought about how long I had lived with shame, how often I had questioned whether my love was enough, whether my mistakes were unforgivable. But now I understood something deeper. Love isn't proven by never hurting someone. It's proven by how you show up after the hurt, how you keep choosing them, how you choose yourself too. I had spent years surviving the silence I was raised in, and now I was breaking it. Not with grand declarations, but with soft, steady truth. I opened my journal, the one Ava had once asked to read someday. On a fresh page I wrote today, "My son told me he is beginning again, and so am I. Our family isn't perfect, but it is honest. And that is where everything good begins." Then just below it I drew a small heart. Inside I wrote one word, still. Still learning, still loving, still here. There was a time when I thought healing would come like a thunderclap, loud, undeniable, complete. But it didn't. It came in glances, in apologies whispered into stillness, in warm mugs of tea shared at awkward kitchen tables. It came in small things, and one of those small things happened the morning of Ava's birthday. She had invited me to join them at the park for a picnic. David had reserved a little shaded area by the lake, and Kira baked cupcakes shaped like butterflies. It was a warm day, the kind that made you believe that some part of life, no matter how messy, would always be worth living. As I arrived, Ava ran toward me, arms outstretched. "Grandma, you came, I wouldn't miss it," I said, lifting her in my arms for a moment, heart swelling. The blanket was already spread full of sandwiches and paper plates and brightly colored juice boxes. There were balloons tied to the trees, each one marked with a word Ava had chosen, kindness, hope, fun, safe. She pointed to the balloon that read, safe, and said, "That one is for you." I nearly cried, not because I was sad, but because I had once feared I would only be remembered for my distance, and now here she was telling me that I made her feel safe. David was quieter that day, not distant, but thoughtful. At one point, as Ava and Kira played a game by the water, he sat beside me and said, "Do you remember the time I fell off my bike in 5th grade? Scraped my whole leg?" I nodded. "You ran inside crying, and I made you sit on the edge of the bathtub so I could clean it. You wouldn't let me touch it." He laughed. "You didn't say much. You just sat beside me until I let you do it." I didn't know what to say, I admitted. I was afraid if I said too much, I'd mess it up. "You didn't," he said. "That was one of the few times I really felt you were there. Not distracted. Not afraid. Just with me." That memory struck me in a way it hadn't before. It reminded me that even in all my failures, there had been moments of quiet love, little fragments that stayed with him even when I thought they had been lost. We watched Ava laughing by the lake. The sun caught her curls and her face lit up like a sparkler. "You did good with her," I said softly. David looked at me. "I'm trying to do better than what I knew." "And you are," I said. "You already are." He turned his eyes back to the water. "You know, sometimes I wonder what kind of father I'd be if I hadn't grown up feeling invisible." I placed a hand on his, and I wonder what kind of mother I might have been if someone had ever told me that I mattered. We sat in that silence together, a shared ache, a shared truth, but also a shared commitment to do something different. To love differently, bravely, even now. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees and the kids packed up the last of the streamers, Kira approached me. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from holding everything together. I recognized it too well. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Of course." We stepped a few feet away from the others. She exhaled. "I wasn't fair to you at the beginning. I judged you based on what David told me and what he didn't say. I made assumptions." I held her gaze. "You were protecting him. I understand that now." She nodded. "But lately, I see how hard you've been trying. And I want you to know, I appreciate it. I see it. It wasn't a full reconciliation. It wasn't a dramatic movie ending. But it was real, honest, soft. Thank you." I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." We walked back toward the others in quiet companionship. And in that moment, I felt something shift again. Not loud, but solid. A bridge repaired. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because something was wrong, but because for the first time in years, something was right. I sat by my bedroom window watching the stars. A soft breeze crept through the screen, brushing my skin like a ghost of something lost, now returned. I pulled out a notebook and wrote a letter I never intended to send. "Dear Mom, you taught me to be silent. You taught me to hide my needs. You taught me that emotions were dangerous. But you also taught me to be strong. And now I'm using that strength differently. I'm breaking the silence. I'm raising a voice that was buried under generations of fear. And I hope, that somewhere in the quiet you'd be proud. Not because I followed your path, but because I finally stepped off it." I folded the letter and tucked it inside the back of my journal. A reminder that the past might shape us, but it doesn't have to define us. We get to choose what we pass on. And more importantly, we get to choose what we stop. The day Ava turned 10, something inside me stilled, not with sadness, but with a kind of reverent peace. Double digits. An entire decade of life, laughter, mistakes, and growth. For her? Yes. But somehow for me too. David had planned a simple dinner at their home. Just the four of us. No noise, no decorations, just conversation and the soft glow of candles. Kira made Ava's favorite pasta and I brought the lemon pie my mother used to bake. The irony wasn't lost on me. A dessert passed down from a woman who never spoke of feelings now served as a gesture of everything I never knew how to say. During dessert, Ava asked for a story. Not one from a book, she insisted. One from your heart. We all went quiet for a second. David raised an eyebrow and Kira gave me a small smile. The floor was mine, so I put down my fork and told her this. There was once a little girl who grew up in a house where no one said, "I love you," where tears were cleaned up quickly and smiles were practiced like chores. She learned to be strong by staying quiet, to be safe by staying small. And for a long time, she thought that's what love looked like. Ava leaned in. But then one day, I continued, she had a little boy, and she wanted to do everything right. So she worked hard. She showed up. But sometimes, she still stayed quiet when she should have spoken. Not because she didn't care, but because she was still learning how. I looked over at David. He was still listening deeply. And even later, when that little boy grew up and had a little girl of his own, the woman realized that it was never too late to speak up. To say, "I love you." To say, "I'm sorry." To say, "I'm still here." Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That little girl sounds like you." I reached across the table and took her hand. She was. After dinner, as we washed dishes, David lingered beside me at the sink. The water ran warm and the clink of plates was oddly comforting. "You've changed," he said, "in the best way." I didn't look at him immediately. "So have you." He dried a plate, then added, "You know what I realized tonight? What that Ava will grow up remembering you, not as the woman who used to be distant, but as the woman who wrote her letters, told her bedtime stories, and never missed a birthday." I turned, then my eyes misting. That's all I ever wanted. To be remembered for the love I gave, not the silence I came from. He pulled me into a hug. A full one. No hesitation. "I think you will be," he whispered. Later, as I sat in the quiet of my home, I reflected on the journey that brought me here. There was no dramatic climax, no vindication, no fireworks of redemption. Just slow, steady truth. The kind that rewires how you show up in the world. The kind that lets you finally see your own reflection not as a mistake, but as a story still being written. I thought about my mother, about the silence she inherited, the silence she handed to me like an heirloom. And I thought about Ava, bright, curious, full of feeling. She would not inherit that silence, because I broke it. Not in a single moment, but in hundreds of them. Conversations, pauses, apologies, and brave steps forward. And with every moment, I reclaimed a little piece of myself. I walked to the drawer where I kept Ava's notes. Little scribbles she'd made for me, crayon-colored drawings, postcards she sent from school trips. I held them close and added one last letter to the stack. "My dearest Ava, if you ever wonder whether love can change a person, remember me. I grew up afraid to feel. I raised your father without knowing how to say the things I felt, but I loved him, fiercely, even when I didn't show it well. And I love you. With all the second chances life has offered me, you helped me become the woman I always wanted to be. And because of you, I know that it's never too late to change the story." With all my heart, Grandma, I tucked the letter into an envelope and slid it into the box. And then I turned off the lights, wrapped myself in a soft blanket, and sat by the window. Outside, the wind danced through the trees. Inside, for the first time in a long time, there was only peace. If you've ever felt like your story couldn't be rewritten, let this one remind you that it can. We don't have to be who we were raised to be. We don't have to carry silence we didn't choose. And we don't have to be perfect to begin again. We just have to be willing. Thank you for listening. If you've lived through something similar or found your way back to someone you love, share your story below. I'd love to read it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Grace's Truth for more stories that remind us it's never too late for healing.